Have you ever looked at someone who did something terrible? A dictator, a corrupt leader, or even just a cruel person in your own life, and wondered, how did they get this way? Maybe they weren't always like this. Maybe at some point they were just ordinary, good even. That's the unsettling question we're exploring today. How do good people turn into monsters? It's not just about the obvious villains of history. It's about understanding the subtle shifts that can happen in any of us. Because if we don't see how it happens, we might not notice when it's happening to others, or even to ourselves. This isn't about fear-mongering. It's about awareness. Because the line between good and monstrous isn't as fixed as we'd like to think. It's a spectrum, and the slide from one end to the other is often slow, quiet, and full of tiny justifications. So let's start with the first step in that transformation: dehumanization. Dehumanization is when we stop seeing others as fully human, when we reduce them to labels, stereotypes, or obstacles rather than people with their own lives, fears, and hopes. It's easier to harm someone if you don't really see them. History is full of examples: wars where enemies are called vermin, political propaganda that paints entire groups as threats, even everyday moments where we dismiss someone because of their job, background, or beliefs. But here's the thing: it doesn't start with violence. It starts with language. The way we talk about people matters. When we call someone lazy, entitled, or evil, we strip away their complexity, and once that happens, it becomes easier to justify treating them poorly. Now let's talk about the second factor: the slow creep of compromise. Nobody wakes up one day and decides to become a monster. It happens in small steps, little choices that seem harmless in the moment, but add up over time. Maybe it's staying silent when you see injustice because speaking up is inconvenient. Maybe it's bending a rule just this once for a greater good. The problem is each compromise makes the next one easier. Psychologists call this moral disengagement. It's when we convince ourselves that the rules don't apply to us, or that the ends justify the means. And the scary part, it feels normal in the moment. That's how ordinary people end up doing terrible things, not because they're evil, but because they never noticed the shift. So what's the antidote? Awareness. Paying attention to the stories we tell ourselves about others, and about ourselves. Because the road to monstrosity isn't a leap, it's a series of steps, and the first ones look a lot like the choices we make every day. Power changes people. You've probably seen it. Someone gets a little authority, and suddenly they're not the same person anymore. Maybe it's a boss who becomes tyrannical, a politician who starts ignoring the people they represent, or even just someone in your life who lets a small amount of control go to their head. But why does this happen? It's not that power creates monsters, it's that it reveals them, or more accurately, it removes the constraints that once kept their darker impulses in check. When people feel untouchable, when they believe there are no consequences for their actions, that's when the shift happens. The famous Stanford prison experiment is a chilling example. Ordinary college students were randomly assigned roles as prisoners or guards. Within days, the guards became cruel, abusive, even though they knew it was just an experiment. The takeaway: give someone unchecked power, even in a pretend scenario, and many will abuse it. But power alone isn't the whole story. Fear is just as dangerous, maybe even more so. Fear makes good people do terrible things because they believe they're doing the right thing. Think about it. When we're scared, we're more likely to see others as threats. We become willing to sacrifice fairness, kindness, even our own values, if it means feeling safe again. That's how societies slide into oppression, how neighbors turn on each other, how ordinary people justify cruelty in the name of security. And this brings us to the third factor: the illusion of righteousness. Nobody thinks they're the villain in their own story. Even the worst people in history believe they were justified. That's the terrifying part. Monsters don't see themselves as monsters. They see themselves as heroes, as victims, as the only ones willing to do what's necessary. This is where ideology comes in. When people believe their cause is so important that anything is justified, lying, violence, even genocide, they can commit atrocities without guilt, because in their minds they're not doing evil, they're serving a greater good. So how do we guard against this? First, by questioning our own certainty. The moment we believe we're completely right, that everyone who disagrees is either stupid or evil, we're on dangerous ground. Second, by staying connected to empathy. The more we humanize others, the harder it is to justify harming them. So here's the big question. If good people can turn into monsters without even realizing it, how do we stop it from happening? How do we resist that slow slide into cruelty or indifference? The answer starts with something simple but powerful: questioning ourselves. Most of us like to think we'd never do terrible things, that we'd stand up against injustice, that we'd recognize evil if we saw it. But history tells a different story. The truth is, the people who did resist, the ones who sheltered Jews during the Holocaust, who spoke out against dictators, who refused to go along with cruelty, they weren't superheroes. They were ordinary people who made a choice, often at great personal risk. What set them apart? Self-awareness. They paid attention to their own thoughts and actions. They asked, am I being manipulated? Am I ignoring suffering because it's easier? Am I slowly becoming someone I don't want to be? This is why critical thinking is so vital, not just about the world but about ourselves. Because the moment we stop questioning our own motives, we become vulnerable to propaganda, peer pressure, and our own biases. Now let's talk about the second key to resistance: small acts of defiance. Big evil often starts with small compromises, but the opposite is also true. Small acts of courage can keep us human. It doesn't have to be dramatic. It could be refusing to laugh at a cruel joke, choosing to listen instead of judge, or simply saying, I don't think that's right. These tiny choices reinforce our moral compass. They remind us, and others, that decency is always an option. And this leads to the final point: the power of community. Monsters thrive in isolation. When people are cut off from different perspectives, when they're surrounded only by those who agree with them, extremism grows. But when we stay connected to people who challenge us, who care about us, who hold us accountable, we're far less likely to lose our way. So here's the hopeful part: no one is doomed to become a monster. Even those who've done terrible things can change, if they're willing to face what they've done. The path back starts with acknowledgement, then remorse, then repair. It's not easy, but it's possible. And for the rest of us, we stay vigilant. We question our own certainties. We choose empathy, even when it's hard. Because in the end, the difference between a good person and a monster isn't some unchangeable fate. It's the choices we make every single day. You know what's fascinating? We've been talking about how ordinary people can become monstrous. But here's what's equally true. Every day, ordinary people choose not to. In small, quiet ways that don't make headlines, people resist the pull of cruelty, and that matters just as much. Think about the last time you saw someone go out of their way to be kind when they didn't have to. Maybe it was a stranger helping someone carry groceries, or someone speaking up when a coworker was being treated unfairly. These moments might seem small, but they're actually the immune system of society, the thing that keeps the worst of human nature in check. So how do we cultivate this immunity in ourselves? Let's talk about 3 daily practices that keep us anchored in our humanity. First, practice seeing the person behind the label. It's so easy to reduce people to categories: the rude customer, the lazy employee, the entitled neighbor. But behind every frustrating interaction is a full human being with their own struggles, fears, and reasons. This doesn't mean excusing bad behavior, but it does mean resisting the urge to dehumanize. Try this. Next time someone annoys you, ask yourself, what might they be going through that I don't see? That simple question can short-circuit the slide into contempt. Second, get comfortable with discomfort. One reason good people do bad things is because it's easier than rocking the boat. But growth happens in the awkward moments, when we admit we might be wrong, when we have hard conversations, when we sit with the fact that life isn't black and white. The philosopher Karl Popper said it best: the true value of a human being is determined primarily by the measure and the sense in which he has attained liberation from his self. In other words, the less trapped we are by our own ego and certainty, the more human we become. Finally, cultivate moral role models, real and fictional, who inspires you to be better. Maybe it's historical figures like Mandela or Mr. Rogers, or fictional characters like Atticus Finch or Samwise Gamgee. These moral compasses matter because they give us concrete examples of what decency looks like in action. And here's the key: don't just admire them. Ask yourself, what would they do in my situation? Here's the beautiful paradox we've discovered: the same ordinary humanity that makes us capable of monstrous acts also makes us capable of extraordinary goodness. The same brain that rationalizes cruelty can choose compassion. The same heart that hardens under fear can soften with understanding. So as we end this exploration, I want to leave you with a challenge. Today, do one small thing that reinforces your humanity. Maybe it's giving someone the benefit of the doubt, or admitting when you're wrong, or just pausing before you judge. Because in the end, the world isn't changed by grand gestures alone. It's changed by millions of people making the choice, again and again, to stay human. If this series made you see yourself or others differently, tell me about it in the comments. What's one insight that stuck with you? And if you found this valuable, share it with someone who might need to hear it. Thanks for joining me in Journey. Remember, the opposite of a monster isn't a saint. It's just a person who keeps choosing, every day, to see and honor the humanity in others. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video. Stay thoughtful, my friends.